Hello everyone. Today we're going to make a video about adding some interaction into our game, and we're going to start with doing a ranged attack. So I've got this level here with my little skeleton in here, and he's got a couple of crates, and what I want to be able to do is when I push a button on the keyboard or the mouse, I want it to shoot this arrow that I have right here in the direction that my little skeleton is facing. So we're going to start by setting up our arrow prefab here. So I've got a sprite right here. I'm just going to pull it out into the scene. You can see it's quite large, so let's go into this sprite's import settings, and pixels per unit will allow us to change the size of this in the world. The bigger the number, the smaller this object will get. So let's try going to 200, and we'll hit apply. And that seems to be a little large still. Let's try 250. Just trying to get it to where it looks. Okay, let's try that. Okay, so here's our arrow. Now the other problem we're going to have with this arrow is that it is at a slant. We're going to want to make this arrow so that it's pointing straight one direction or another. So let's see if we can get it pointing straight up. And so the best way to probably do that is to actually make an empty game object to hold the sprite, so we can straighten that sprite out up here in the scene. So let me collapse these floors. Alright, so we've got our arrow here. Let's go ahead and add an empty game object. And actually we're going to reverse this. We're going to put the arrow inside the empty game object. And we'll make sure the arrow is zeroed out. And then let's rotate this arrow so that he is facing straight. So somewhere right about there. It looks like we had to rotate him at about maybe 43 degrees. And I believe that's pretty straight right there. Okay, so you notice here his coordinate system is a little bit weird, but in the game object we've got him lined up almost exactly along the y-axis. Looks like I can rotate him just slightly more to the side here. Let's go back and see if he lines up. There we go. So now we're lined up pretty close along the y-axis. So when I make these arrows and shoot them, I should be able to get them to go the direction and point the right way. Alright, let's rename this as arrow, and then inside of there we'll have the arrow sprite, so we can just call this arrow sprite just so that we don't get confused about what we're doing. Okay, this arrow is going to need to be able to collide with things. So let's add a box collider to this arrow. And then of course we're going to size it down so that it is a little bit smaller. So let's try a 0.15. Let's try that. And we can make it a little smaller on the Y. Maybe offset it slightly. Something about like that. So we have a collider on here, and let's make this a trigger. We will trigger an event when this arrow hits something. Alright, so he's all set up with the box collider, and we can also probably give these arrows a rigid body, because one of the objects in a collision needs to have a rigid body. So let's just go ahead and add the rigid body to the arrow. We'll make sure we turn our gravity to 0 because this is a top-down game, and that should be good. We should be ready to go with our arrow. Alright, and let's just drag this arrow now down into our prefabs folder here, where we have some prefabs. So let's just drag him right in there, and now we have our arrow prefab, which will be all set up and ready to go, so I can delete it from my scene. Alright, now that I have my prefab set up for my arrow, now we can go in and look at making arrows and launching them across the screen. So that's going to be some scripting. Let's see what script we have attached to our skeleton at this point. He's got his top-down player movement script, so let's add some lines of code here to allow him to shoot arrows. So let's find that top-down player movement script and open it up in Mono Develop. Here's our top-down player movement script that we have attached to the skeleton that's controlling his movements and animations right now. So let's add in a public game object variable to hold our arrow prefab. So we'll call that arrow. We'll link that up in the inspector out here. Back to our skeleton in Unity, and in his script we have a slot for the arrow. So now we can go into our prefab folder where we just saved that arrow. Let's drag that in. Alright, so now the script knows what an arrow is. Now that we have the arrow linked in, we just have to pick a button that we're going to use to be our attack button for ranged weapons, and then just instantiate and get those arrows popping in. So let's just go down here towards the bottom of our update function here, and let's check for some input. So we'll say if input, we're going to do get button down, which will allow us to specify a button in our input manager. There's one in there called fire 1, which is hooked to the left mouse button and the, I believe, left control key. So we'll try fire 1 here as our ranged attack button. So if we get a press on that button, then what we want to do is instantiate the arrow prefab at the position and rotation of our player. But we also are going to want to be able to tell that arrow to move. We'll probably maybe try, we can either push it on its rigid body or move it with the transform translate. We'll probably push it on its rigid body. So let's make a variable to hold our new arrow. So game object, we'll call this new arrow. We'll set that equal to instantiate, and then we have to tell it the object that we want to instantiate. That's our arrow prefab that we just linked into that arrow variable. And then we have to tell it where to put it, okay, where to make it. So we want to create it right where our skeleton is. So we're going to, and this is the skeleton script, so if we say transform.position, that will put it right where it is. And let's try putting it at transform.rotation and make sure that it actually lines up correctly, since we had to rotate it there to set up. Alright, so this will make one of those arrows appear. Let's save this and let's see if we can get arrows to pop in here when we push our left mouse button. Alright, so we're going to hit play and let's push that left mouse button, and it looks like, what did we get? Let's see if we can see. We got to collapse these blocks here in the floor. Alright, oops, I was in the wrong window here. Let's go to our game window and let's push the button. And okay, see, we got an arrow, and the arrow is actually pointing up. Let's see what happens when we push it here. Now the arrow is pointing back, so it looks like the arrow is reversed rotation of my player. Whichever way I'm facing, it's popping an arrow in the wrong direction. So we can fix that a couple of different ways. Maybe the easiest way would be just to take our arrow prefab here. So let's drag one of those, we're in the prefab folder. Let's drag one of those back out into our scene, and let's go into the arrow, and the arrow sprite, let's rotate it so that it's facing down instead of up. Let's rotate it around so that it's pointing down. So let's make that about 137 or so. Let's see how that looks. It looks like it's a little bit crooked. Let's take it back a little bit more the other way. Let's try to get it close. There, that looks pretty close to being straight. So now it's oriented down. Let's apply that to our prefab so that it'll get the change, and delete that out of our scene. Alright, let's try now and see if it's going the right way. So when I click my button, now the arrow's pointing in the direction, whichever direction I face my player. It's dropping that arrow right there at the center of my player, pointing right down the way we want it to go. Alright, so that's getting our arrow to pop in to the scene. The next thing we want to do is actually make that arrow move. So we're going to go here before we make the arrow. And what we can do here is we can actually give this arrow a push. So since we saved it under a name, we can access it. So we create it, we right away access it, we can say new arrow, and then we can get component from that arrow, and the component that we want is its rigid body 2D. And then what we can do is we can actually do the add force command, and we want to add force, probably relative force, and we got to tell it which way to push it. So we wanted it, let's see, it's lined up on the y-axis, so let's give it a push on the y-axis. So we need to give it a vector 2 here, relative force. Let's do 0 on the x, and let's push it a little bit on the y, and let's just see what happens here, because we got to make sure it's going to move the right direction. So this will push 0 on its x-axis, 100 on the y-axis. And let's see, oh yes, we need to say new vector 2, and we have to construct it this way. Alright, so there we go. Oh, need another closing parenthesis. There. Let's try it now. Alright, and when I hit my button, the arrow moves. Now, notice it's moving backwards, okay? So it's moving in a positive y direction. That's because, let's see if we can pause this for a minute, find that arrow here in our scene view. Let's see, there it is. You'll notice that positive y for this arrow is pointing this way because of how we rotated it. So let's just push it in a negative y direction, and that should make it go the way we want it to go. So let's just put this as a negative 100. And again, what I'm doing is applying force to the arrow's rigid body, which will cause that arrow to move. It's going to use the physics system. But here we go. And now, whichever way I'm facing, it shoots the arrow in that direction because I'm adding a relative force to the arrow. So there we go. And we have arrows flying all over the place. Now, that's pretty slow speed. So what we'd end up doing here is actually replacing this with a variable. So let's make a variable up here to control how hard to push the arrow. So let's do a public float, and let's call this arrow force, and then we can replace this negative 100 down here. Why don't we leave the negative here, and we'll do a negative arrow force so we can give it a positive number out in the inspector. That'll make a little more sense to people who might want to tweak this out there. So we'll apply a negative arrow force to our arrow. That will allow us to control this out here. If we go to our skeleton, we can now find this arrow force, and we can add like maybe a 500. Let's see what that does. Let's see how fast we shoot now. So maybe that's a better speed. Just shooting that arrow at a 500. I think that's pretty good for now. Okay, now we are shooting when we push a button or a key on the keyboard, and we've got the arrow flying across the screen. So now we have to add some interaction with objects. So this arrow is set up with a box collider that's set as a trigger. So what we're going to need to do is either have certain objects look for collisions with the arrow, or we could have the arrow look for collisions with objects. Either way works fine. I think for now we'll have the arrow actually do that. So we're going to have to add a script to our arrow that will just be listening for trigger collisions. Collisions will trigger colliders. So let's make a new script for that arrow. So create new C#. We'll call it arrow script. And we'll attach that to our, let's grab one of those prefabs here. Let's drag an arrow out here into the scene, and then we can grab the arrow script and drag it onto my arrow over here. There we go. Apply to the prefab and delete that out of there. All right. A couple of different ways to attach things to objects. That was one way. Let's open that arrow script up in MonoDevelop. Here's our arrow script. So what we want the arrow script to do is just right now listen for collisions. So I'm going to take out all the default things inside the script, and let's just put in a void on trigger enter 2D function, which is a built-in Unity function that will run automatically whenever our arrow here hits any object with a trigger collider on it, or a collider on it in general. And then we want to have room to save information about the collider that we hit. So we want collider 2D, and we usually call this something like other, so that we can store information about what we hit. And then basically what we can do is when we hit anything with a trigger collider, we can tell that object that it's been hit and to apply some damage to itself. So again, several ways to set these systems up. This is just one way. But what I will do here is I'm going to have it send a message to whatever it hit that has the collider on it. And so that would be other. That's the other object that we hit. And we'll say dot send message. And then we have to specify a function name that we want to call on the object we hit. So let's make a function here called take damage. And then we can also send it an amount of damage to take. So let's send it a variable called damage that we'll have to make up here at the top. Right here at the top then, let's make that damage variable. We'll make it a public float. Actually, let's do integers for damage. Public int damage. And we can set that in the inspector. That way we can have arrows do whatever amount of damage we want very easily. So what will happen now is whenever this arrow hits a collider, it's going to send a message to that object that it hit to run its take damage function. Now, not all objects in here may be destroyable or damageable. So we want to add another piece in here that tells Unity that it's okay if the object we hit doesn't have this take damage function. Okay, so we want to do a send message options don't require receiver. What this means is that we don't care if it has the take damage or not, because that way when our arrow hits walls or other things that have colliders on it, we can have the arrows go away and they can still send the message, but if nothing's there to receive it, it won't give us an error in the console. So we have that set up to be able to tell objects to take some damage from an arrow, and then let's have this arrow destroy itself when it hits the collision. So we'll say destroy, and then we're just going to say game object. That's the game object of the thing the script is attached to, so that would be the arrow itself, and it will then remove itself from the game. So let's just have the arrow do just this in its script. So we'll save that. Okay, so now what we want to do is, let's see, we have some colliders on these little wall pieces here. There are colliders on the chest. So let's see what happens if we shoot something now. Alright, so we're going to shoot this wall. Oh, and you notice it's blinking out right away. That's because there's a collider on our skeleton. So when it's hitting the collider on my skeleton, this box collider here, it is right away destroying itself. So we either have to tell the arrow to ignore the player, or we have to make the arrow position itself outside of the player's collider when it's created, so that it doesn't get the collision. Alright, so we can do either one. Let's see what it looks like if I just tell it to ignore the player's collider. So what we would do here then is, before we would do these two commands, we would do a check to see what is it that we hit. So we'd say if other, the other object, dot compare tag player, we'll make sure our player has the player tag. Then what we want to do is put brackets around these guys. And now we don't want it to act if it's the player. We want it to act only if it's not the player. So what we can do is put an exclamation point here in front of the other. This means not. So if we can say if it's not the player that we just hit, then do this. Okay, so if it's not the player, then send the message and destroy yourself. If it is the player, it will skip all of this and the arrow should get to go on its merry way. So let's check that now and see what happens. Alright, so now if we shoot an arrow, oh, I gotta make sure the player is tagged. Skeleton is not tagged as a player. So there we go. Tag your capital P player built-in default player tag. Now if let me shoot, there we go. Now the arrow launches out, and I think it looks okay to have the arrow launch out from him like that. Alright, let's see what happens if it hits one of these walls now. See how it goes away when it hits the wall. It should also go away when it hits the crate. There we go. I'm not getting any errors about these objects not having the function that we told it in the send message. So that's good. Now we might also want to look at how long does it take the arrow to disappear when it hits things. It's disappearing right away. We might actually want the arrow to get about halfway into an object before it disappears to make it look like it's going in. So we can fine-tune our arrow here a little bit. Let's go ahead and pull one out here into the scene, and let's fine-tune that box collider here a bit. So let's make it so the box collider doesn't start until about halfway back. So let's change the size down on the X a little bit. Oh, not the X, sorry. On the Y a little bit to something maybe a little bit more like this, where it's going to start. We can even change the offset a bit here to tuck it back a little bit further. So now the arrow should stick about halfway in before it actually disappears. So let's apply that change to our prefab and then delete the arrow out of the scene. Let's see if that looks a little better. Just kind of fine-tuning a few things. So there we go. Let's see how it looks in the crate. There we go. So now it looks like it's going a little bit further in before it disappears. So I can shoot arrows all over the place, and if they hit something with a collider, they remove themselves. So then basically we want to make sure in our level that we have colliders around our rooms and such. I haven't put them around this whole entire room yet, just up here in the corner. So we want to make sure we do that so we don't have arrows that keep moving forever out in our scene. We just want them to go away and contain them so they're not hitting things off screen either. Okay, the last bit here then would be just to add the interaction of the crates here taking some damage and being destroyed. So that means the crates, or any objects that we want to be able to take damage and react to the arrows like that, need to have a script on them as well. So let's make a script here for our crates. So new C# script, we'll call this the crate script. And let's go ahead and attach that to one of our crates out here in the level. These are prefabs, so if I attach it to the crate here, then I can hit apply and that will attach it to all my crates. So both crates that I have out here now have this crate script. And then we just need to open that crate script up. So let's find that crate script. There it is. We'll open that up in MonoDevelop. And then let's make sure this crate, first of all, knows how much health it has and can take damage from the arrow. Alright, so let's give the crate some health here. So let's do a public int health. And then we'll set that out in the inspector. We don't really need a start function or even at this point an update function. So let's take those out. Well, all we really need right now in this is just that take damage function that we set up for the send message. So we'll do a void, and this actually has to be a public void so we can find it from outside of the object here, and it was called take damage. And take damage was getting sent an integer number, so we have to set up an integer parameter or argument here for we'll just call damage. Okay, and then take damage is going to apply the amount of damage that we just took from the arrow to our health. So we'll say health minus equals damage. And then let's check to see if we still have any health after that. So if health is less than or equal to 0, then this should be destroyed. So for now, let's just destroy this game object. Okay, so once it's out of health, we'll destroy it. It'd be cool actually in gameplay to have some sort of a particle system play when it destroys, or an animation or something. But for now, we'll keep it simple. We just want to know that we took damage and ran out of health and this got destroyed. Okay, so how this works is when the arrow hits an object, if it's not the player, it sends a message saying take damage. This is a function name that it's looking for in the object that it hits. And then it's going to send the amount of damage that we set up here in our inspector for the arrow to give. Alright, so this has to be spelled exactly the way the script is in our crate. So exactly the same right here. So when the arrow hits this crate, it will call this function on the crate. It will pass in the amount of damage the arrow does. That amount of damage will be taken off our crate's health, and if our health is fallen below 0, we will destroy the crate. So that is how this kind of a setup works. So out here in Unity, let's give our crates, actually we can just do this to the prefabs. So let's go to our crate here. He now has health. Let's just give him 5 health points. Okay, if I change it to the prefab here, then it will change it out here in all these. See, these automatically got the 5. That's why prefabs are great. Let's go find our arrow, and we have to give him an amount of damage to do. So let's say the arrow does 5 damage, which means that one shot with the arrow should kill the crate. Alright, so we've got damage there, we've got health on the crate. Let's just test this out and see if we can get rid of crates here when we shoot them, and there we go. That did cause the crates to be destroyed. Okay, and then when we hit the walls, walls aren't destroyable, so they don't have a take damage function. So we're good to go. Alright, so there is one way that we can do shooting and add interaction in with our projectiles. So if you need this in your 2D game, now you have an example on how to do it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you found it helpful. As always, leave comments below or talk to me if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer them. Have a great day.